All right, 571 area code. You've been waiting patiently. I forgot that I had someone in the queue. My bad. That's on me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. You can hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you good.
Okay. My name is Dan Norton,
Okay,
and I've
yep.
got a YouTube channel too. Do you mind if I mention what it is before we get into it?
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna put someone on hold real quick.
Okay.
I'm gonna put you on hold and then I'm gonna pull you in after. All right? Okay. Yeah, you were saying?
Yeah, so I've got a YouTube channel. I promote Ayn Rand's ideas. So
Yeah.
I typed in the chat before that I'm anti-Trump and anti-left, and you said you didn't know what my politics were. And
I,
so I can
I
tell you now.
actually, I actually clicked your, I actually clicked your channel and I've heard you on the Majority Report before.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess for anyone who doesn't know my channel, I can just say it out. If you're just listening, it's just my name, Dan Norton 1 on YouTube, and my last name is Norton.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I've debated Sam Cedar many times. A few months ago was the last time.
Hmm.
But anyways, I like to go on shows like this and just talk with people and provide a different perspective.
Yeah.
So we could, I mean, there's so much we could talk about. I'm not sure what the best place is to start, but I know you're more on the left, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would. So we have lots to disagree about, but maybe some things to agree about as well.
I'm curious if you, as a Ayn Rand type, so like a libertarian, um,
Sorry, could you say that one more time? I accidentally turned
uh,
on my
no problem, no problem.
laptop sound.
I was saying, like, I'm assuming, like, as a Ayn Rand type, as a libertarian, I'm curious, do you agree more when it comes to the issue of trade with someone like Trump or with someone like Milei? Donald Trump, obviously, big into protectionism, potentially isolationism. Milei, much more like trying to get rid of the barriers, do a more free trade, and so on and so forth. Well, how do you feel about that?
Would definitely be more on the Malay side because
Yeah,
it follows from the principle of not coercing people, not using force. So with tariffs, you're using force to make people pay a tax on goods, which
yeah,
they're not voluntarily choosing to set their prices. You're being forced by the government. So I would oppose that for sure.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's
I believe in free trade.
it's good to hear some consistency on the right. Which I expected you
Well,
to. I expected that to be your position. Yeah.
yeah, the term right also, I think it can be a little misleading. Like I am very strongly opposed to Trump, but
Yeah.
historically, I think the term right has often been associated with people who are pro-capitalism, meaning
Yeah.
separation of state and economics. But I don't think Trump is like that by a long shot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but yet he's often called someone on the right today. So I think the term is a little misleading, or
I think
can
I
be.
think there's
So I mean, if Trump is on the
there's
right,
a
I'm not on the right.
variety. Yeah, I think there's variety, right? Like there's obviously there's libertarians which are more economically non-interventionists. I would say they want as little government as possible, um, or in some cases for some people no government, right? But there are of course like right wingers that like it's that four quadrant political spectrum is not perfect, right? But if we're like, yeah, if we're looking at that, there are people that prioritize right wing economics and more personal freedoms. There's people that prioritize right wing economics and less personal freedoms. Same thing happens vice versa on the left. And I would say that someone like Donald Trump, in my view, probably is a type to have like not so interested in the personal freedoms, but very interested in deregulation and austerity and so on and so forth. But if I was a libertarian, you know, I would not. I would also would hope I would not be a supporter of someone like that because I think the lack of respect for personal freedoms is glaring with Trump.
I think he has. He's like he. I don't follow him super closely, but I think he's made threats or like towards journalists who attack him. I don't think he's a friend of free speech. So that's
Yeah,
another area where I would disagree with him. And of course, January 6th.
yeah, yeah.
I think he lied massively about the election and tried to steal the election. So maybe he should
Yeah.
be in jail for that. And
Hmm.
I think it's a very sad state. It's a very sad commentary on America that someone like Trump is our president. Unfortunately, I
Yeah.
don't think The other candidate is very good either. I think it's usually just a choice of lesser of evils,
Yeah.
in my view.
Yeah.
Sadly, but I just wanted to also mention, because you brought up the term libertarian before.
Yeah.
I often get called that, but Ayn Rand actually distanced herself from the libertarians. She thought they had basically plagiarized her, and they had taken one principle of her philosophy out of context, the non-aggression principle, as it's often called,
Yeah.
or the
Yeah. Yeah.
non-initiation of force principle.
Yeah.
And then they think it's compatible with any other sort of philosophy. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter whether you're a Buddhist or a Christian or Islamist or whatever. They have the kind of big tent approach.
Yeah.
But she thinks to actually have that principle consistently adhered to and to make any sense of it, you need a more fundamental philosophy to support it, which libertarianism lacks. So she has a philosophy called objectivism, where she lays out an entire framework of metaphysics and epistemology and ethics. She's an egoist in ethics, and she has a distinctive view of that. And she's very opposed to anarchy, whereas I think many libertarians are anarchists and they're anti-state. Actually, Milei, I think, unfortunately, is one such libertarian. I think he doesn't. I've heard that he doesn't, in practice, plan to get rid of the state, but he wants to get at least a much smaller state.
He'll run around as like Captain Antcamp, I think, and then he'll send like the very heavily armed police against protesters, which tends to kind of happen to. You see, when it comes to sort of, I'm using like libertarian as sort of the umbrella term, because obviously there's variety with it, right? Like there's the paleo libertarians that I've seen on TikTok back in 2020. They kind of fell off. I haven't really heard much of them lately, but they were essentially like, it was so fun. I want to get into this because I'm curious about your perspective on this. So I'm using libertarian as an umbrella term, right? But there's like groups. What do you think as someone that you describe yourself as an objectivist? It sounds like to me you're sort of like a more like you're like an Ayn Rand purist in a way. How do you feel about like back in the day? Well, I say back in the day, like 2020 was like a million years ago, but like it was like the political TikTok era is a different era, a lot more community based and so on. And I remember like the libertarian side of things. They went through different phases. They went from like calling themselves just MAGA to libertarian to minarchist to anarcho-capitalist, and then eventually I think the last thing that I saw before I became less engaged with them, or where they fell off, where they started calling themselves paleo libertarians, which kind of meant they believed in conservative social views and using it seems like using some sort of way of enforcement to ban things like porn or gay marriage or something like that, but then they still claim to be libertarian. What do you think of the variety of your group? Every group has variety, but libertarians have a pretty wild group of people.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's my group. I distance myself from them, but I don't follow them very closely, so I don't know all these subdivisions within them. But I do know, I've heard on the issue of foreign policy, I think for decades they've been very anti-American, and I think at least recently also anti-Israel. And I think that might just follow from their being anti-state or anti-government. So when you have one government, which is like at least, well, I would say the U.S. historically has been the best, at least in many respects, the best country ever. I think it's gotten worse over the last century or so with the growth of government, with the New Deal and the. I'm
a big fan of that.
Yeah, I'm sure you are.
Yeah.
But I think historically, back in the 19th century, after slavery, I think that was one of the big problems at the beginning. That was one of the inconsistencies with the founding documents of the country. Not everyone was given the right to liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But to make the country more consistent with that, we fought this war. But in the late 19th century, I think that was probably the truest time to the original principles. That's when they were practiced more consistently. But I think there has been even improvement since then with things like gay rights.
So would you say
And
like the Gilded Age is kind of like I'm not trying to like put words in your mouth. Would you
yeah,
say late
yeah, the
18th century? Yeah.
so-called Gilded Age. I don't
Yeah.
think that's a great term for it because it suggests there's like this veneer of goodness, but it's just a surface covering like these massive injustices.
Yeah.
I think the 19th century, the history of it is often distorted and smeared, and I think it's unfair that that happens. But yeah, that is the period I'm talking about, late 19th century, when there was tons of progress, and you had immigrants
Yeah.
coming from all over the world because they saw so much
Yep.
freedom and opportunity to make a better
Yep.
lives for themselves. And I wish immigrants today had that same kind of freedom and opportunity instead of it's so hard now to immigrate legally, and as a result, I think you get lots of illegal immigration. I don't
Yeah.
think that's because they're bad people. I think it's
I
because
think
we have
it's
bad laws.
I 100% agree with you there. I think the way that our immigration system is currently is almost the biggest reason why we have illegal immigration. We make it slow, we make it complex, we make it ridiculous and completely inefficient. And as a result, people will still respond to the demand for work, and to their personal need to, grow their income, support their families, and therefore people will come here illegally, right? So if we just had an efficient system, you were referencing the late 1800s, where people were much more easier. It was much more easier for people to immigrate to this country, right? You come to Ellis Island, and you might be rejected if you're sick, but otherwise, boom, you're a fucking American, right? Now, I'm not saying we gotta go that simple. I think there should be some sort of background checks, but man, if we could do it in like 1 or 2 days or a week, let's fucking do that. You know what I mean? I have no problem with people being able to come into this country, work, and I don't know how you and Sam Cedars' relationships are. I remember your debates are pretty contentious, but Sam makes a point that I bring up often. I mean, 80% or so of undocumented workers have been here for over a decade. Those people have been building the economy, growing our food, and so on and so forth. They deserve to become an American citizen and be treated like other Americans. You know? But I guess where we differentiate, I do think that there are obviously major problems in the Gilded Age. The insane inequality, the fact of the matter that when you have these firms, these companies that grow in power, the natural inclination for a lot of them is to dominate. Is to crush any potential opposition in the form of like unions, is to potentially, if they can, have a community which the company owns and people live in that community, go to work, go back to the company owned housing, and essentially just work for a king in a way. But they're in the corporate world rather than the royal world. I think, but I'm not a socialist. You know what I would say? I think the purpose of government almost should be to being a counterweight. Now, do they do that perfectly? Do they always are they always a counterweight to corporate power? No, and I think they've been doing that real bad lately. But the way we get to our ideal world is obviously complicated for all ideologies, and it will take time, and sometimes we're opposing, so we'll see if we can come to some solutions on specific issues, right? I will say this about the Gilded Age: they had less wealth inequality than I think we do now, so maybe we gotta move a little bit more towards the late 1800s or something. I don't know.
Well, I don't think wealth inequality is a problem per se. I mean, it depends on what is the cause of the inequality. So
Yeah.
if you become rich by stealing from people, or by running some kind of scam or pyramid scheme operation, bilking people out of their wealth, like Bernie Madoff, then I think that's unjust, and you should go to prison if you scam people out of their wealth. But if you get rich on a free market through voluntary transactions, like if you make some amazing product like the iPhone that billions of people around the world love and they want to buy it, and they're willing to give you hundreds or thousands of dollars to buy your product, then that's a win-win kind of situation. You have someone, CEO getting rich, but that's because he's run an amazing company that's benefited so many people. So it's a win-win. It's not like he's exploiting people and living off their backs. They're both benefiting. So I think it depends on the kind of inequality. It's not inequality per se that's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this, you also use the term king, which I think is kind of a smear term, because what
Yeah.
kings had, they used coercive power, they used physical force to rule over others. So they didn't have, not everyone had equal rights before the
Mm-hmm.
law.
Mm-hmm.
But a CEO is not like that. A CEO can be thrown in jail.
Well, I
Um,
think I agree with you that there are obviously going to be differences between a CEO and a king. I think the only reason I referred to them as that is because of the power that a lot of times these CEOs and bosses might have over their workers, whether that's working overtime to prevent them from. Oh, I see. I got a donation here. Ah, you gave me $2 to try to roast Coffee Pot, but thanks for the money. um, but yeah, like I was saying though, I got a little distracted by the donation. The corporate structure is very top down. The bosses and the board do ultimately get to make a decision for most decisions, and I don't have a moral problem with that. That's why I'm a capitalist, right? I don't think everything needs to be publicly owned or worker owned, and so on and so forth. But overall, I would just like to see more democracy in the workplace. And also, in addition to what you were saying, I want to see an economy where good results and good work is rewarded, right? In the sense that, like you said, if there's like a product like the iPhone and it becomes beloved, it becomes liked, it becomes well used, yes, the CEO should be able to make money from that. But I would also hope that the workers do as well. And that's why I'm a bigger fan of like the sort of economic situation that we had in the mid 20th century. Again, besides the social issues, right? Like the anti-gayness, the racism, and so on and so forth. But when we had a situation where CEO pay went up, productivity went up, workers' wages went up, I think that that's pretty good, right? Now, there are things in that period of time that you probably disagree with or don't like, but I'm curious if we both agree that we would like to see wages going up with their CEOs and with the companies that they work for.
Yeah, I think that's good, and I think that happens. And I think like a company like Apple, you had lots of millionaires, or a company like Microsoft. It's not just the CEO who makes everything. You have the engineers and the managers who become wealthy as well, and you have all the stockholders that who make a fortune. So I don't think
Mm-hmm.
there's a dichotomy. And I there's another objectivist podcaster, Yaron Brook. He's the chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute. And I heard him
I've heard of
recently
him, yeah.
talking. Okay, yeah. So he recently mentioned on a podcast that the current generation, Generation Z or whatever it is, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
they actually have it much better off than previous generations. If you look at the real wages as opposed to like the nominal wages, and I think if you factor out things like inflation, they're actually better off than previous generations. So I think
That's an
there's myths
interesting
that are
claim, but
often floating around.
that's an interesting claim, but I don't know if that's true because I do know that there's obviously we've seen wage stagnation since the 70s and 80s for all groups pretty much, in a massive way. But in addition, we've seen like, and I believe these were adjusted for inflation, when you compare the wealth at certain ages of the different demographics, like the boomers, the millennials, the Gen Zers. I mean, the boomers and the Gen X. It's from what I remember, it's pretty much like a downward trajectory. Boomers had this amount of money at a certain age. Gen Xers had a little less, but a much more reasonable amount. Millennials had significantly less, and then Gen Z follows suit. So that's an interesting point that Yaron Brook make, but I just don't know how true that is.
Yeah, well, there's things that aren't factored in, like if you just look at wages as opposed to like the lifestyle. Like for instance, the internet. The
Yeah.
internet did not exist like
Yeah.
35 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But how is that priced in somehow to the wages? I mean, you still get paid a salary or wage at some job, but how do you factor in the value, the standard of living that we enjoy now because of things like the internet and
Well, I don't doubt that
uh,
we have a decent standard of living compared to people of the past, right? Times are very different than, say, the 1800s or 1700s and definitely beforehand. So I would much rather live in the modern day than the days before internet, the days before the entertainment I like, and so on and so forth. But, I don't think like, when it comes to the basics of fundamentals, I don't think that we are necessarily in a better place when it comes to, like, when you compare, like, wages to cost, You know what I mean? Um, like I said, shit has been stagnant for a while, and you could have things like the internet, but that might lead you to having a part-time job, a service job, but then you don't really make enough for rent. So then you also have to use your wonderful technology, which I very much appreciate, like the phone, and end up also working a second job at Uber and doing that to make ends meet, right? So we have great technology, but the situation, the issues of the Gilded Age of low wages and high and rising cost still maintained to this day, you know?
I don't. Yeah, I guess I don't. I don't want to concede that
Yeah, no,
we
I get it,
have
I get it.
stagnant wages or that they've been going down. I mean, I guess one question you could ask yourself is, would you rather be living in the economic period of 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago? I don't think so.
I mean, I think
So
when you ask a question like that, there's like a bunch of things I like about my life today. That's why I would want to live in a time right now. But if we could just exclusively switch, let's just say like the neoliberal approach and the Keynesian approach, let's just say we flipped it and like we had neoliberalism in the past and Keynesianism today. I would much prefer to live in a time with like my the many aspects of life that I appreciate with the Keynesian economics, you know? And there is a sacrifice with it, right? One of the big principles that Keynesian thinkers believe in is instead of having like boom and bust cycles that are massive surges, but also therefore big dips, right? Massive bust. You just have more of a stable, subtle growth, but then a more subtle decline, and then a subtle growth again. I would much rather do that. Sacrifice the sort of financial gain of the stockbrokers, you know, where they could be making billions upon billions. I'd be satisfied if they're making millions if we could have more stable growth and people's lives aren't ruined in dramatic bust. You know what I mean?
I think we could have more growth than we do if we had a more free market, and actually government intervention into the banking system through systems like the Federal Reserve, I think causes lots of problems. Massive inflation. You have the government printing, trillions of dollars of monopoly money and inflating the currency. And you have things like FDIC, which creates moral hazards. People don't pay attention to where they're banking. They just think
Yeah.
the government is going to bail me out if my bank goes under.
Yeah.
And I think this has been the case throughout the history of the United States in various degrees. Like from the very beginning, there was the first bank of the United States, a central bank, and then there was the second bank of the United States. And then during the Civil War, you had greenbacks, and then you had the Federal Reserve System. So we haven't had free banking in this country for most of its history. But if you look at places like Scotland or Canada, which had free banking, or at least something much more close to it, they didn't have these boom and bust cycles and these runs on the banks and these panics, which periodically plagued the United States. So I think we could have a lot more steady growth, as you mentioned, but we would get that if we had a freer banking system instead of the government intervention, which actually created the Great Depression, I think. Because the Fed was
I
established
think there's
over
I
a
think
decade
there's
before the Great Depression.
I think there's many factors that went into the depression. I think for example, and yes, you know what? I'll concede this. I think there was some government intervention that impacted the depression in a negative way. So I would say that the real starter of why it happened was a lot of reckless speculation, right? People taking out loans that they couldn't afford, and when a lot of times when you have markets like Wall Street, when a few people panic and then everybody else panics, there's a big domino effect, and suddenly everybody's selling off and the market's down and all that stuff, right? So then an economic crisis started in the U.S. and the world in general, but then the government intervening, which I feel like because you seem like a fairly consistent person, I feel like if you were around at the time, you'd probably be against, like, for example, what the Hoover administration did when they added new tariffs, right? That made it so that a lot of tariffs were put onto us, and products are more expensive here, and then our companies weren't making the sales that they needed to here and abroad, so they had to lay people off. So stuff was getting more expensive and people were losing jobs. So I agree that not every government intervention is a good thing, but I would also then say, responding to Scotland and Canada. Scotland and Canada are also like a lot smaller than the United States in terms of things like population and economy size overall, so it's kind of hard to compare with them. But it was then, in my view, government intervention with the New Deal. I know you're going to disagree with it, but I think the New Deal played a massive part in getting people back to work, getting money in people's pockets, and setting us in a much better direction, not just in regards to the Depression, but through the post-war economic period. They call that the golden age of capitalism. Donald Trump keeps saying we're going to be in a golden age now. That was our golden age in my view. But again, during that period of time, that's when we saw the middle class essentially be born in the United States. That's when we saw wage growth matching the CEOs, matching the productivity. That's when we saw the most unions. So that's really where my aim is. My aim is not to overthrow capitalism and so on and so forth. I know people on the more libertarian right side of politics say that no, we don't have capitalism. They have, but those are more the ANCAP types. I think we do. But my aim really isn't radical. I don't want to overthrow the system. I want to make sure that like that United Healthcare guy, right, that got killed. I want to make sure people like him are able to live long and healthy lives, So if we had Medicare for all, single-payer healthcare, I don't think he'd be the CEO of United, and I think he would be alive today, right? It's kind of like when FDR was president, and he was saying to the capitalists, like, listen, if you have hungry people, they will gladly throw away freedom for food in their belly, Now, I know he's not your ideal politician, and he's probably not an ideological match, but I think we can all resonate with his point that, like, yeah, when people are suffering, that's when they turn to extremism, whether that's killing CEOs or whether that's, voting in someone like Hitler or something, right? So that's my priorities, just maintaining the system and making life a little bit better. But, yeah.
Well, one thing I would want to mention here is that I am of the view that we are definitely not capitalists today. We are far from capitalists. The way I understand capitalism, following Ayn Rand, is that the government is not involved in the economy. Yet we have these trillion-dollar programs like Social Security, or many billions of dollar programs like Medicare, Medicaid, public education. So these are massive interventions. These are far from what a truly capitalist society would look like. If it were a truly capitalist society, all there would be is basically three things: a police, military, and the courts. And
that's sort of what I hear from like the sort of self-described minarchist types, right?
Yeah, sometimes it's called that, but I don't really like that term because
sounds a little too much like monarchist.
Well, no, I think it's closer to anarchy. Like, if you imagine a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum you have like totalitarian governments like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, and on the other you have anarchy. With maybe like a place like Somalia. I'm not sure what the best example is, but you just have these warlords in total chaos, war of all against all, and then right next to that you've got laissez-faire capitalism. I think that's a distorted sort of view of things, because I think capitalism is radically different than anarchism. I mean, I think it's like a utopia, like heaven on earth, whereas anarchy is hell. So it's not like your next door neighbor.
I think that's the thing, right? Sometimes when it comes to these political discussions, there's different definitions, right? So I think it's all right that you have that description of capitalism, which is essentially like less state, separate the state from the economy. But when I talk about capitalism, I think this is what most people are referring to when they're talking about capitalism is a sort of having private ownership of the means of production, right? Having private property and so on and so forth. And a socialist might have the perspective of like, well, I think that, we are coerced into working because if we don't work, we die. Therefore, it's not really this voluntary exchange. Therefore, they have a moral, ethical problem with that. Therefore, we should have worker ownership of the means of production, workers making decisions for every firm, and so on and so forth. That's not my position. My position is if you own a small business and someone wants to work for you, pay them well. If you get enough workers, let them have a union. But yes, ultimately, I'm perfectly fine with the structure of you making top-down decisions in your own business, right? I think that that's fundamentally capitalist in my perspective. But it's okay that you have a different definition. I understand. If someone's talking to like a libertarian or objectivist or any of the spectrum of potential libertarian ideologies, again, I'm using libertarian in the big umbrella term, there would be that likely definition of or the likely distinctions between what they view as capitalism and so on. So it's expected, but yeah. I guess we've been going on this for a while. It's been actually pretty civil, and I respect you for that. I appreciate you for that. But my throat is kind of sore, and I've been streaming for like some 2 hours or so. So, any final things you want to discuss before I log off?
I'll just say I appreciate the conversation, and yeah, it was civil, and that's how I like it to be. It's not like that usually when I have called into Sam Cedars' show. I think they're less civil or not civil, and they try to mock their opponents, and yeah. I think that's unfortunate, and actually makes them look pretty bad in the way they treat people with opposed views.
Yeah. I try my best to match the energy, and obviously there's a lot of people that will call in disrespectful, so then I'll be disrespectful, and it's good entertainment for people, I guess. But in general, if someone comes off as respectful, I try to treat them that way. Though I will say, I think the reason why some people might be like a bit more extremely opposed to libertarianism, and I guess just like being direct about my position, I think it would be really bad. Let's say we adopted, like, what you described. Ayn Rand's view is like getting the government out of the economy, right? So that would also imply like getting rid of social programs and so on and so forth. I think that would kill a lot of people, just being honest. So I'm very morally and practically when it comes to just like results, I'm very opposed to it. But overall as a person, I respect you for calling in and being polite. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the opposite in terms of like what the results would be. I think our system would make lives much better. And,
yeah.
I think lots of lives have been cut short and lost because of government intervention, but that's a whole discussion.
Yeah, that's a whole discussion.
Yeah, and so, but if you're going to have the discussion, I think it's best to be civil. I don't think it's really productive to just be ad hominem, throwing ad hominems and insults. So I appreciate that you didn't do that. I mean, some positions, I don't think they deserve respectful treatment, like if you're a Nazi, and you might just want to hang up on those types. But if if you think a position is respectable enough to discuss with someone at all, then I think it makes sense to try to do it civilly.
Yeah. Of course. So like, do you usually call into like shows like this? Like, you ever seen any of the other YouTube vertical stream debate guys and called into their show?
Yeah, I've done some of that. Like I called into Matt Binder's show once. He has a similar sort of format.
Yeah.
And I've called David Pakman's show a few times.
Yeah.
And been on Modern Day Debate. These are all on my YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to check out my previous conversations, just go to my channel, Dan Norton 1 on YouTube, NORTON. And if anyone out there wants to have a conversation with me, feel free to get in touch. You can just get in touch with me through my YouTube channel, leave a comment, or you can send an email, and I'd be happy to try to set something up.
Yeah. Hey, well, best of luck to you. How do I compare to some of these other creators out there? Besides Sam, we already talked about Sam. I like Sam, but like some of the smaller creators.
I guess similar. If I thought about it for a while, I might have something more insightful to say, but I guess
ideologically really similar to them.
Yeah. I guess roughly similar. There's no giant differences that are leaping out at me.
Yeah.
It's been pretty casual, so I guess that maybe a little bit more casual and relaxed.
Yeah.
than some of the other ones I've been on, because this wasn't a scheduled debate. Like most of the discussions I've had, I've like arranged in advance, and I've emailed with the person, and we've set something up, and there might even be a moderator for the debates.
Yeah.
So this is pretty informal and relaxed, but I've enjoyed it. So
Yeah.
it's been good.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, brother, have a good night, man. Appreciate you calling in.
All right. You have a good night too. Bye bye.
Yep. See ya.